All right, welcome to Classic Metal Class, session number 33, first of the new year. It's me and Scott. Scott's over in Boston. I'm here in Milwaukee, and we're going to be talking a lot about the notion of genres in heavy metal, something that I think, divides people quite a bit, maybe unnecessarily in some respects. And it's a topic that we talk about a lot, you could say, in passing, not looking at it directly, except when we do shows specifically on like this genre or that genre. And as like everything that we look at, it turns out to be way more complicated than you might originally assume. In the present day, there are a whole bunch of different recognized genres or subgenres, but it's kind of messy. Some of them seem to overlap with other genres and even non-metal genres, and a lot of these involve communities and stuff like that. And so we're gonna explore this quite a bit. And I think that a good place for us to start is talking about genre in general, right? And so, there's genre as like a dictionary definition applying across the board, and then we can talk about musical genres. So I'd be interested especially as a practicing musician, somebody who's a expert in the field, get your take on some of these. Like, do these actually work, or are they a little bit too vague? So Merriam-Webster says a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. That's that works, right? Is it a little too vague though, or what do you think?
It almost has to be a little too vague because that is the definition of it. But then you can debate whether things, they fit the criteria, but that's kind of what we're going to do, right? So I think particular style you might have.
Okay.
I think that is the part that maybe makes you think vague because, well, what is a particular style? Like, give me an example. I don't know how I would rephrase that. But
that raises a really interesting question from the start, right? So if we have to bring up particular examples, you think back to like Platonic dialogues, right? And one of the things that Socrates does that's basically his shtick is he asks, hey, what is justice? Or what is this? And then somebody like says, hey, here's a bunch of examples. And then Socrates says, that's cool, but I don't want any of those. I want the thing that identifies every single one of them. And, when you're doing philosophy and you're teaching it to college students, you're like, hey, this is the way to go, right? But in the back of your mind, you're also thinking, Socrates, you're being kind of unfair, right? Because it is hard to define things without bringing up examples. And when you're defining genre, you're defining, it's actually a philosophical term. Genus, genera, is the thing, and then species are below it, so it just means like a classification, and then we use it in these contexts to talk about different communities and traditions. So we can talk about massive genres like blues or jazz, or classical has to be divided into subgenres, rock.
Yes.
And then we get lower and lower, and we start getting more, as they say, granular. But even then, each of the genres that we might look at for any of these metal bands is going to include thousands and thousands of bands,
Right. I think this is part of what we're doing today. Absolutely. But that definition 40 years ago would have applied much easier. This day and time, now it's just you have. Back then you're right, blues, classical, but classical you can you can sub genre by period.
Yeah.
The impressionists, but that now it's like with modern art, and you ask a visual artist what they do, they don't, unless they're directly copying impressionism, they can't just point to, well, it's modern art.
Yeah. And a lot of times people use the word neo to signify that they're like reappropriating something. You don't really see that much in musical genres, I would say. There is an interesting prefix that does get used in some cases, and I never know what the hell it's supposed to mean, and that's post.
Oh yeah.
Like post punk or post rock, or what exactly have you gone beyond? What's the new thing that you're doing but you have to like tie it back to something that you emerged from.
Well, that's the definition. So when they say post punk, it means this is music that existed after punk specifically. In other words, it's rooted in punk.
Yeah. See, the rooted, I think, matters. The simply coming after doesn't tell you much, right? Because you could take a band that often does get called post-punk, New Model Army. Okay. So definitely like the punk edge to it, the raw sound, but the musicians are much more virtuosic than most punk bands were in the 70s, who didn't seem to be particularly interested in learning their instruments.
Right.
And the music tends to be, let's say, a little bit more melancholy or militant than some of the other punk stuff was before. But you could also say, what about Iron Maiden? Aren't they post-punk?
I was just going to say the first album.
Yeah. Well, but Steve Harris is very, very clear. We are not a punk band. They don't know how to play. We do stuff like that, right?
That fits your definition, though.
Yeah. But then, think about like the first album, and then the third album is still also after the rise of punk. So we could say, well, that's post-punk too. But no, that's not post-punk. That's a different genre, clearly, So I think sometimes it has to have like some sort of content or style connection. It's not enough for it to simply be after something.
Yeah,
Um,
but if you point like it's post whatever you say, it's derived from that in some way.
Yeah.
Like
here's an interesting point. Andy says, I've heard neo soul used as a description for that revival that occurred in the early aughts.
Yes, that's one that's used
And
a
then
lot.
she also brings up the use of like first wave, second wave, and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, we could say those are genre terms. They are like locating something within a musical genre that's also a tradition. So coming back to like thinking about definitions of this, Wikipedia has a definition for musical genres saying a category that identifies pieces of music as belonging to a shared tradition and or set of conventions. Now, I'd like to get your take on this, Scott. They say it's to be distinguished from musical form and musical style, though in practice these terms are sometimes used interchangeably. So what would be the difference between genre and musical form, or genre and musical style?
To a musician, form means the arrangement.
Okay.
In other words, many people would understand. You have a verse and a chorus that you go to, like the big chorus, that comes back that you wait for.
Yeah.
That'll be called the A B section. So once the band has all that written out, they might go, okay, we're gonna go A, then B, then C, then back to A, and then out with like 3 B sections. That to me is the form.
Okay.
But I don't. Otherwise than that,
I mean, you could say that some musical genres are much more tied to form than others, right? I mean,
there's like classical form. Like
yeah.
there was going back, there were specific forms. Like people will identify, oh, that's arranged like a classical form, even though it's not classical music.
Yeah.
But
I mean, a very rigid example would be 12-bar blues, right?
Yeah. Well, exactly. You could say that it could be a metal song. It's like, don't worry, it's just a blues. Even though you're playing metal, you told the musician it's 12 bars, and you know where the notes are changing, the chords are changing.
Yeah, and you're
But
just going 1, 4, 5, 1. Yeah.
but I wonder if form here means um uh how it's presented, the format, the form, because I don't really understand how they're using form.
Okay. You mean when you say how it's presented, do you mean like in terms of medium and performance? Like, is this there are some bands that make music and then don't actually like perform it live, like Steely Dan was notorious for that, you
Right.
know. Um and so or would that be something different? That would be the mode or medium by which they reproduce it?
That's a good question. I, I'm thinking like form meaning well, I'm thinking that in style or synonymous in that case.
Okay.
Like what kind is it? What kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
music is it? I don't know if there's it, I whoever wrote that, I would ask what form meant to them, because if you say that to me as a musician, that's how the song's constructed to be
Yeah,
arranged.
and when I read that, I was like, it's to be distinguished not just from musical form, but musical style. And it seems like style is, at least for subgenres of metal, style's pretty central to it. You can do something in a sort of power metal style, and then you expect certain musical traits to it. Like it should be fairly harmonious and driving ahead. And then if you were going to change that into a death metal song, the lyrics should you could have the same lyrics, but they're going to be sung differently. The
Well, the metal
virtuosity
version,
of the guitarist isn't probably going to be that different from each other, but you
well, it's
know,
like when people say, "Oh, it's a metal version," like the metal version of
oh
Ride My
yeah,
Diamond. It's the same form, it's the same song, it's the same lyrics. Um,
yeah.
but as we so much discuss, it fits. It's a very metal song that Christopher Cross wrote.
Well, you bring out different potentialities that were just kind of latent there when you turn it metal, and I think too, like it's got to be and there's a bit of a digression. It's got to be the right band to do the right cover. Like
Yes.
that worked with Saxon. I don't know if Venom had tried to do it, that it would have worked, or if Raven had tried to do it. Um, I
Well,
mean,
it's
go
a
ahead.
good point, because um, there's a song from the Top Gun soundtrack by, well, I don't know if they wrote it, but Cheap Trick performed the song called Mighty Wings.
Okay.
And Robin Zander's an unreal singer, but a lot of even death metal bands have done covers of that tune.
Oh,
It's good.
really?
If you look up Mighty Wings cover, and
Okay.
like even like the Cookie Monster voice, and then on the higher parts, this other guy would come in. But it even though it's kind of like it's Cheap Trick, the metal version works really well. I mean,
Yeah.
like with the double kick comes in when when it's really building. So I guess, well, what's it called when then you have like, okay, it's kind of what we're talking about. Rock. Okay, well,
Yeah.
rock means anything. Okay, well, we're talking about metal. I don't
Or
know.
a subgenre. I mean, we can use the word genre, subordinate genre, whatever we want. And I mean, this is also something that ancient Greek philosophers spent a lot of time on. You can have like a really high level classification, living being, right? And then you got plant and animal, and you can differentiate animal into rational animal like human beings, non-rational animals. Then you got a million different kinds of those, and you can keep going as far down as you want to until you don't have any differentiators anymore. In order, so here's something that might be helpful going forward. Whenever we're going to say this is a distinct genre, we got to be able to say what's distinct about it. We have to be
Right.
able to say how it's not the same thing as something that's on the same level, or what's on the higher level. What is new, or what is additional, or what's taken away from this other genre, you know. And I think that makes it difficult to classify some bands and albums and you know movements, because we can be like, oh, I'm not sure if it fits in here or fits in here, you know.
That's a great point. I'm thinking even if I ask, a lot of my students are in different kinds of bands, and
Okay.
one of the genres is math rock or math metal, and so if they describe themselves as math metal, if I were to ask them why is it math metal and not, I'm not sure they could articulate it because
Yeah.
I mean math, is kind of like, oh, we're gonna make time signatures tricky, and we're gonna make, well then isn't earlier Rush math rock?
Yeah.
Can you go back and re say what the genre is? Because if anybody was pushed enough about these subgenres, even in the bands that they're in, because that's why I have a hard time describing what it is I do. Well, it's kind of this. It's kind of got some of this. Picture if so and so and so and so and so and so had a baby.
Yeah.
Like, but I don't really know how. It's not like, oh, it's like a classic rock kind of band. It's like got that vibe.
I mean, there are musicians who are able to say, "I do this and only this," you know. But you're right. That does seem to be, I think, perhaps because of the commercial nature of doing music. If you only do this, you'd better be really, really good at it and have an audience that wants to buy all of your records and go to all of your shows, because otherwise you can't make a living. You
Well,
know?
we have two examples that we had discrepancies about. Blue Oyster Cult,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Well, is it metal? It's a thinking man's metal, but Motorhead, you know, to
Yeah.
let you, it was just rock and roll, and but they made
I
the
think
jack.
I think he's being kind of disingenuous with that, though. I mean, I think he does realize. You look at the bands they toured with,
Well, right,
and what's that?
you're right, and
Yeah,
it's like heavy rock and roll. I mean,
yeah,
it is because I mean his whole ethos is just rock and roll.
yeah.
I wouldn't say he's got a metal. He's got a no nonsense. This is rock and roll. I'm gonna drink Jack Daniels. You know, like people call Guns N' Roses now hair metal, but they were the antithesis of that. So where does they were
Yeah,
just a rock band.
that's actually kind of a funny one, right? I mean, what it shows is that genre is flexible enough to like swallow up the bands that are supposed to be a reaction against it, right? Because notice what it didn't swallow up, it didn't swallow up Metallica, which at that time was still making, straight ahead Metallica thrash metal stuff, because thrash metal was its own genre that had reacted against, whatever we're going to call it, pop metal, light metal.
Right.
We're not like those posers with their pushed
Yes.
up hair and, fancy clothes and all that. We just wear jeans and band t-shirts and let our hair hang down, rather than putting hairspray into it. So,
And that's a big one. There is with a lot of the metal bands, they will wear concert shirts now, actually. And
yeah.
either ones they like or ironic ones, like they'll wear Britney Spears shirt.
Yeah, yeah. I
Um,
mean, that's been going on for a long time, though. You can look at bands in certain genres in the 80s, and I think thrash metal is a good example of that. And they would wear band shirts, sometimes their own band shirts,
yeah, that's
quite
right.
often. Whereas you wouldn't see Iron Maiden doing that back
Well,
then.
Yannick Gers does it.
Well, now, but I'm talking about like the 1980s. He wasn't
Mm.
even on the scene then.
Oh, you're right.
Um,
I agree.
in Motorhead's old videos, that are put out as the official videos, you will see some of them wearing Motorhead shirts from time to time. Interesting, you know. So let's come back to this notion of genre before we like go way off field. So, if we ask, well, what actually is a genre? There's a couple like classic treatments of this out there. And one of them is coming from this guy Ronald Burnside, and this is in the 70s. He's writing about this, and Deena Weinstein, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, she brings him up, and he talks about how genres develop. And he uses three terms: formation, crystallization, and decay. And I think this is this is a good theory. It makes sense of why it's hard to identify a genre while it's happening. So in the formation phase, the newly emerging genre and the differences between it and its parent genre aren't that clear. So, like heavy metal and rock, right? Is
Right.
heavy metal a distinctive kind of rock? Well, yes and no. I mean, think about the 1970s. It's not exactly clear what counts as heavy metal. Some people are willing to say that Queen is heavy metal, or
Right.
Pink Floyd, even, you know. But there's clearly some bands that are more at the core of it. And then you get this crystallization phase. And I think that you and I were around for quite a few of these, where a genre is now identified as that genre. Think about thrash metal in the
Right.
mid 1980s, right? So it's got its origin in the early 80s, but you and I didn't really become aware of it in the Midwest until we could hear at least a little bit of it on the radio, borrow some tapes and copy them, have somebody jazzed up about Metallica tell us about them, and then, get a Megadeth tape or an Anthrax tape or something.
Anthrax, yeah.
Yeah.
I put them as the poster children for that genre. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe because when they came out, they were. I mean, it was a step beyond Metallica with the heavy and the speed.
Yeah.
You know,
So that's the crystallization phase, right? And then we get, I think this is really interesting, a decay phase where what he says is the style becomes so predictable that composer and audience begin to lose interest. And this is when a genre is kind of tapped out. I think this is part of what happened with punk. I mean, how much attitude, how much, non-musicianship, how much breaking things can you do before you're like, all right, we kind of exhausted that. Whereas with other genres, if they have more to them, you can keep like working them through. You think about prog rock,
right,
now at a certain point, audiences were like, not another 14-minute solo, but
right.
you
No,
know,
that's a really good point as far as this is really interesting. This is the decay phase where because predictive that both composer and audience begin to lose interest. Yeah, I mean, like I remember well, look at Somewhere in Time. Now, I love that album. Of
yeah,
course, everybody hated it, but I think Steve Harris says we don't need to write another Piece of Mind, but we're still going to sound like us.
yeah. I
So
mean, I would say at least where I was, the reactions were mixed. There were some people who were like, this isn't what I'm used to. I don't like this. And then there were a lot of us who were like, oh no, this is really cool. Somewhere in Time is great.
oh yeah,
You got this cool song, Alexander the Great, about this,
yeah,
it's like 7-8 minutes long. You got weird stuff like The Loneliness of the Long Distance
I love that
Runner.
one. That's a
Yeah.
great one.
And Wasted Years, of course, has become
That,
part of their repertoire. So
yeah.
it's not, actually it reminds me of another album that I think is really awesome and got totally panned, which was AC/DC's 1983 Flip of the Switch. And I actually bought it in a Target bargain rack for $1 because it didn't sell.
Right.
And
It was
people didn't people said they didn't like it because they thought it was like it's just the same old AC/DC. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. There's some great songs on it, like Bedlam in Belgium and Nervous Shakedown and stuff like that. And I think people still don't listen to it to this day, and it's great. But
that's
maybe that's part of that what was genre decay phase, for
I think Queensryche went through that because
hmm,
Operation Mindcrime. I mean, Rage for Order seems to be the favorite of fans, but Mindcrime was a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And then they put out Empire, which was different. It was a little more radio friendly.
Yeah.
But then they tried to do Mindcrime too. And I bought it.
Yeah.
And it didn't, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to do a Mindcrime too.
You know, we should do a show sometime about phenomena like that, where you've got something super, super successful, seems to be a cool formula, and it can't be extended further in a way that lives up to it, you know? I mean, you think about another example that is Quiet Riot's Mental Health #1 selling album. Condition Critical is good, but
Yeah.
it doesn't break any new ground, and I think interest kinda started going down, because where are you gonna go from #1, right? Um, and we could look at, well, why? What didn't work? Maybe we'd also have to look at some examples of cases where a follow-up did work, you know? Um,
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, uh, if you're told by the A&R guy, you know, do another one of these. Like some guys complained that because Still of the Night was such a huge song for
yeah,
White,
yeah,
that every producer was like, give me a Still of the Night. And like, are you crazy? It took them, look how long it took them to get there. We're not
yeah,
gonna write you know, and I don't think the comfort zone really works all the time. You
yeah.
know, you know, do another one, do that again. It's, well, you have to think that, you have to believe that the first time around that it was very methodical.
The
But
only way that you can really pull that off is if you've got stuff that was supposed to go into that original project, and it got cut, and it didn't, like, make it through,
that's a good one.
you know? So here's 2 examples of that. One would be Pink Floyd, and, you know, The Wall comes out, and it's massive, right? And there's another album that comes out, you know, a little bit later on, called The Final Cut, which didn't get a lot of airplay and all that. I think it's actually I like it the best out of all their albums.
It's a great album.
And all that is stuff from the Wall era, more or less, that didn't make it into the Wall. And you can you know, you look at it, it's a much more melancholic, slower album
Yeah.
than the Wall was, but it's dealing with a lot of the same themes. England is going downhill, what's happening, and all of that. And then, you know, Judas Priest, a good bit of the stuff on the Ram It Down album is stuff that was done in the time of Turbo.
Yeah.
But it had to carry through to another album. So I mean, you could call Ram It Down Turbo 2, and it's before you get this massive shift with Painkiller, you know,
Oh
into the
yeah.
90s. So
I think the best example of that is one of the Rolling Stones' biggest selling album was Tattoo You.
okay.
And that was just leftover songs that they cut from the last album. You know, that Tattoo You like was already, you know, it turned out to be the better stuff. You know, so they left Start Me Up off of, what was the album before, but they left Start Me Up off of there. They, you know,
Yeah.
and you're thinking, well, that's probably one of the most recognizable, you know, if you ask the common person. I'm not saying like somebody that goes to their shows would be like, well, it's Sympathy for the Devil, or it's, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to genres again. So if we look at it from the vantage point of the present, there are a ton of, like, genres out there, some of which developed in the 90s and 2000s. So there's no, like, agreed upon list of them. Encyclopedia Metalium, which I think is a great site, 16 genres they distinguish, which include black, death, doom, electronic or industrial, experimental, folk, gothic, grindcore, groove, heavy, and we'll come back to that in a bit, metalcore, power, progressive, speed, symphonic, and thrash. And now when you look at that, you're like, okay, some of these are, you know, a little bit tougher to define, like experimental avant-garde. Some of them seem to, like, fit together really well. and they have a cohesive thing like black metal or death metal or doom metal. Others are kind of veering off into other people's stuff, where there's a lot of overlap. And then there's ones where you're like, I'm not sure if there's actually a good dividing line historically between speed and thrash. There's a continuity there. The Metal Genres list site has 38 main genres. Now, I think once you get that extensive, maybe that's too many, Uh, those are main genres. Those are not like subgenres.
I want to point out that some of them, as everybody can think, like if you say glam metal,
Yeah.
these are ethos based ones.
Okay.
So if you didn't see the band and you listen to it, you might categorize it differently. What's another example of it? I'm looking through goth metal.
Yeah, good example. Yeah,
You need to be dressed up all goth. That's more like would Evanescence be goth metal or symphonic?
Yeah, that points out another issue, which is some of the bands are, I'm not even going to say straddling, they're in both genres, right? And it might depend on where you're looking at in the band's career. There are some bands that will start out as this kind, and then they're going to shift. The next album will be a different kind. And so if you're asking what is this band, there isn't you could say from the vantage point of the present, they are X, right?
Right.
But if they've got a long tail of being something different, then I think you have to include that in there, because a band is kind of a historical object, right?
Yeah, I mean the look and I guess the lyric content,
Yeah,
like like Striper Christian metal,
yeah. But they're also glam, right?
but they're also glam, right? You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But unlike the other glam bands, because they're not going to get drunk and hit on your girlfriend,
Yeah.
or they will, but
They will.
only in secret,
Only in secret. That's right.
like the old joke about the born again Christians, that you take, if you only take one of them fishing, they'll drink all of your beer. So you got to take two of them. They're watching each other, so they won't drink your beer.
So I haven't heard that. That's good.
Yeah. Now Wikipedia will actually add several other categories: alternative metal, which I don't think is a well-defined category; Christian metal, crust punk, and Latin metal. Latin metal, okay, I think that kind of makes some sense. If you're incorporating Latin rhythms and instruments, then I think you've got something like that. And
what would it be if you're just speaking in Spanish, for example?
Well, that's interesting, right? Because there is that Baron Roya band from Spain, and I would classify them as like just straight ahead traditional heavy metal sung in Spanish,
Right.
Whereas, and then you could also think about like, well, what about like Sepultura, right? Well, okay, so not Spanish, of course, Portuguese, but because they're Brazilian, but they also sing in English too. But they're thrash. They've already got a clearly defined category they're belonging to. And then, with some of these categories, like if you're going to say that the new wave of British heavy metal is a genre, that doesn't seem right to me, because it looks like there's a lot of different genres developing within it. Regular, straight ahead, traditional heavy metal. There's some glam. Wrathchild, I would say, is a glam band. Of course, Venom starting black metal in there. Raven, I think, is speed metal.
And
so
there's one missing here. I mean, I would put, if I had to make a genre name for, say, King Diamond.
Oh,
wouldn't that be
falsetto metal?
What'd you say?
Falsetto metal.
Falsetto, but theatrical metal, like the whole
Abigail. Oh yeah. Interesting.
I mean, because he tells stories,
Yeah.
And he acts them out with the sets and stuff, and they could almost make movies out of them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say that. So you could call that what they sometimes call shock metal, right? And then it would include like Alice Cooper earlier on.
Yes.
I guess, I mean, but there it's less about musical style and it's more about what you're doing on stage, because Wasp did stuff like that, right? Um, and I mean, would you consider, would Operation Mindcrime then be theatrical metal because there's a coherent story
Yeah, but
that,
they did all the videos too, and then when you
yeah,
saw it live, they would act out like they had that woman singing that act as Sister Mary.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean, it wasn't a musical, but that it was. I always said it was like watching a movie, listening to the whole album because it just
yeah.
flows so nicely. Um,
I
I
mean,
don't
Pink Floyd's The Wall could qualify in that sense as well,
or
right?
I guess yeah, like and that would have to be distinguished from a concept album, which is tough to do. I
Yeah,
think I think King Diamond is definitely like you go and there's theatrics when you see him in the show.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, falsetto metal. That's a good one. I think you should coin that. But
I don't know. I don't know how many entries there would be in that though.
yeah, he owns it.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about some history. Could we actually say that there were like recognized genres of heavy metal in the 1970s? I don't think we can if we're thinking about the way genres are used today. In part because nobody was quite sure what heavy metal even was, even though people were doing it. It was kind of a messy genre. As we've talked about before, it was often like a derogatory term. You know,
Right.
we don't want to listen to that heavy metal crap. You know, that's dead. Now it's time for disco or punk or whatever else you're going to do. Um, Now there are definitely like metal scenes emerging in certain places, like the UK, especially, and parts of the US and Canada, Germany, Japan. And I think that we can definitely say that at least heavy metal, like an overall genre, is getting distinguished from, you know, hard rock where it's pretty adjacent to it. Punk, there was a lot of like, punk is junk, metal rules,
Right.
kind of
Fuck his
clashes. Yeah. Um, and of course, disco, but at the same time, there were some bands that did call themselves heavy metal that made forays into disco. I mean, look at Kiss, right? With Dynasty.
Yeah,
Um,
Dynasty, it's all there. Even um, I love the tune "Sure Know Something." That's on Dynasty, right? Yeah,
Maybe, yeah,
but it's got the disco bass line in
yeah.
the verses, and then
I
it
mean, the
becomes
one that like epitomizes it for me is, I was made for loving you, baby.
right.
Which
Yeah,
my youngest kid. So it tells you like, kids pick up on like things that are really prominent. When she would request that song as a toddler, because I would play Kiss in the car, she called it the whip song.
the whip song. Yeah,
Because I was there, it's got that part where like there's a crack of a whip. So
that's and that's a song that non-Kiss fans love.
that's true. Yeah. Yeah. And
Non-Kiss.
that's another thing sometime that we should like do some research on. What metal and metal adjacent stuff made it into all of these things that have like created new audiences, like Guitar Hero, or being used often in karaoke, right? Because
Right,
those are ways that people can get introduced to metal stuff even if they're not metal fans.
right. Yeah. Well, it's the old story about Extreme with when they put up Porn Graffiti and More Than Words was their hit.
Oh
And
yeah,
everybody ran out and bought the album that didn't know who they were. And then everybody tried to return it
they're like,
because,
what's all this other crap?
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
it's kind of like they felt like it was a bait and switch, you know?
yeah, yeah.
You say that it's this kind of band, what a pretty song. And then the rest of it's like, well, see, how would we say extreme? Like funk rock or funk metal, or I don't think they're metal. I don't think extreme would be called.
Well, you could include them in like the glam spectrum, I guess, because it's so undefined, right? I mean, if Bon Jovi can be considered metal, which I don't really think they are, but people will classify them as that. I think there's probably room for extreme as well.
They would see that's the reason that hair metal is a tough one
Yeah.
because they're I mean, you know, John Bon Jovi, just the whole band was especially in the Slippery and Wet days when they were just very glam. But the easiest thing would be to call them glam metal. But they were never metal. They're a rock and roll band. Early on, it was AOR.
I think that was in part because in the 80s, especially the mid 80s, it was so lucrative to be considered heavy metal, that a lot of bands were willing to pick up that mantle, and then like do interviews and in Circus or Hit Parade or stuff like that.
Yeah, that was a band that crossed maybe cross genres at the time. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people were into them that were metalheads, but it wasn't. I mean, in like the stuff. New Jersey was their first rock and roll album. I think Slippery When Wet. That was melodic rock, I would call it. You know, uh,
Yeah.
the big choruses and you know uh, the emphasis on having a good melody to sell it.
Yep.
Um, but they also had like you give love a bad name. What do we call that? Anthematic, like those
Yep.
anthematic songs where you pump your fists, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that might be the sort of thing people used to use the term arena rock. That's exactly
Arena
the sort of
rock,
thing. Yeah.
yes, that's perfect. And that's easier. That's a little clearer to me. You know, like you will play a song, it'll be big, right, with the big choruses,
Yep.
and
So everybody can be involved and
yeah,
stuff.
it's like, oh,
I
that's
mean,
arena.
yeah, I mean, it is a bit of a side note, but like Bruce Dickinson has talked about this in his biography that when you're playing in an arena, and his style for like the way he sings and moves around on stage is oriented towards having a huge crowd that you have to do these big, big, big gestures for, like you sing and you've got the microphone clearly up to your mouth and your other arm is out and your legs are kind of akimbo, and then you'd like jump up on the speaker.
Right,
The guitarist is playing, so you're like gesturing at the guitarist so everyone looks at him soloing.
right, yeah, yeah. But that's definitely playing arenas is a whole different thing. That's hard work. I
Yeah.
mean, not that I've played arenas, but just by looking, it's very different than reaching 100 people in a club.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to do those kind of gestures in a club, you'd look a little ridiculous probably.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen it. Like I saw Honeymoon Suite, and they had their time with that.
Oh,
What's
Andy's pointing out Saxon didn't, because Saxon, when they were here in Milwaukee, Biff Byford, of course, is doing all that kind of stuff, like singing and like looking out at the crowd. That was sort of it wasn't an arena, but it was still a fairly sizable venue, the Riverside Theater here in Milwaukee. So, and then actually, yeah, same show at the Potawatomi, Northern Lights, when it still existed. And they did a longer show there because they weren't supporting Judas Priest. They were there with Black Star Riders. So I stand corrected a little bit. Well,
Wait,
let's. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say. So you're saying Saxon didn't do the gestures?
No, they did. They
Oh,
didn't. As they moved into a smaller space, they didn't like change the, what would you, I guess, choreography. Would we say? Um,
but it was. What did you like it? I mean, I would love
Yeah, it
it.
was great. I mean, it's Saxon, and there's also something about seeing um, seeing these guys or women who are in their 60s or 70s. They produced some of these songs 30, 40 years ago, and I mean, the same thing with Blue Oyster Cult, or Uriah Heep. You see them and they're playing, and you're like, holy crap, they have the energy, they have the movements. I mean, somebody who's really good with this is Alice Cooper. In his
Yeah.
70s, he still gets up there, jumps around, spins his baton, takes off his top hat and stuff. And, so Biff Byford is somebody who's clearly like that lead singer of Saxon. Um, Others, what's interesting, we saw Judas Priest 4 times in the last 12 or so years, and Rob Halford was clearly not doing as well in, like around 2012, 2014, I think, when we saw them. He was kind of shuffling around on stage. I'm not saying he's like jumping off the speakers or anything now, but he's certainly moving a lot more fluidly.
Yes.
And I mean, his vocals are still very, very strong,
Oh yeah.
Um, so it's pretty impressive to see that level of energy and physicality.
Yep. I think, another thing here is, like the Paul Stanley rants, that would be in an arena. But if
Yeah,
I saw
yeah,
them in a small club, I'd be disappointed if I didn't get Paul Stanley rants.
yeah, yeah.
So, and especially if he did, it's so funny because the rants are like, could be on an album and have names to them, like the Cold Gin rant, right?
Yeah,
We met some people backstage, and but even in a small club, you want, and I actually had talked to Buck Dharma about that. I'm like, why doesn't Eric do the rants anymore? Those were like, I could quote every rant from every live album, and we as kids we loved it. It was just so part of the show. And he's like, yeah, I that kind of is missing. But I don't know if how much energy or if Eric has to save his voice, because that's kind of an impersonation, or when he does the voice, it's not his speaking voice. It's
yeah,
more.
yeah.
But anyway, that's just
Well, let's talk about moving into the 80s. So I mentioned Deena Weinstein. She has, these early sociological studies of heavy metal. And she actually proposed, she's writing from the vantage point of 1991, that we should divide heavy metal into 3 super genres, which you can place on kind of a spectrum. So at one end, you've got whatever you want to call it, light or pop or glam metal.
okay.
And, so this is like less heavy, it's more ballads, more radio friendly, a lot of focus on costuming, makeup. The lyrical focus tends to be a lot on love and sex and partying and drugs. You're not going to get like, Satan come, visit us. We're going to burn all the churches down, stuff like that. You're not getting a lot of stuff about,
That's Norwegian death metal.
yeah, but you're also not getting a lot of things about like the horrors of nuclear war, stuff like that either. And
Right.
so I would say some prime examples of this would be like Dokken,
Yes.
after Shout at the Devil, from like the next album onward, Motley Crue, because Motley Crue is pretty heavy at first, but
Yeah.
after
Then
that,
Theater of Pain.
yeah. And then Poison, I mean, they were always there. Cinderella, Bon Jovi, if we want to consider them metal, they'd definitely be in there.
Yep.
And then at the other end, she locates what she calls speed or thrash. And now this is kind of interesting because, she's taking those as like the epitomes of what we nowadays call extreme metal, which also includes like death metal and black metal. And this is, much harder and heavier and fasting, more extreme. And the aesthetic of it, like we were talking about earlier, tended to be wearing a band shirt, maybe
Yep.
like a leather jacket or a denim jacket if it was cold, and then no like spandex or anything like that.
Right.
And hair, it doesn't get put up, it lays down, and you do a lot of head banging.
Yeah.
And so examples of that would be like Accept or Exciter or Raven. Then we get massive thrash bands like Metallica and Megadeth. And then in between, she calls it like heavy metal. And I think this is kind of a common thing. We can talk about traditional metal, heavy metal. This is the stuff that we're used to as sort of like the middle of the road. So, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Scorpions, Dio, Man of War, Armored Saint would all fit into to that, and they can be kind of glammy. I mean, think about the dress for Judas Priest in the Turbo era, right?
You're right.
That's more glammy than what they were wearing on stage just one album earlier with Defenders of the Faith, right?
With the leather jacket and the, Halford with then yeah, they changed big time.
Yeah, and we were just joking about Ozzy Osbourne and how terrible he dressed for the Ultimate Sin tour. He basically looked like a frowsy old PTA mom.
Well, the thing
And
is, I I want to ask because even though we grew up at the same time in different places, but
yeah,
all of us, even at the time, thought it was ridiculous
yeah. I mean,
to see Ozzy like
it
that.
was a progression. I would, he
Yeah,
wasn't dressed like that in the first couple album tours. But
no,
apparently, a lot of this, apparently, from what Jakey Lee says, came from Sharon. She
yeah.
she liked a certain look, and
Well, she wanted to go with the times.
yeah, I guess. I
Yeah,
mean,
she's like, do what the
if
kids are
you
doing.
if you have to have like shoulder pads in your stuff and you're not Gore, maybe there's a problem.
And you're not Gore.
Yeah. So okay, now here's what we can say. Okay, this kind of makes sense, right? Glam on one end, thrash and speed on another, the mainstream of heavy metal in the middle, and it ties in with gender. Glam is appealing pretty equally to men and women, maybe even more to women. Thrash at the time, that's a boys' club.
Yep.
There were a couple women who were into that, but not much. And then the middle grade is a little bit more. Um, receptive to women being at shows and stuff like that, but it was still pretty male dominated. But does their classification really work when we're thinking about genres? I mean, it's tough to locate some bands. Where do we put like Rat or Kiss? Are they glam? Well, yeah, but they're not glam in the same way that like Poison is. And Rat's got some pretty heavy stuff, and so does Kiss from time to time. So maybe they're more toward, maybe they have to be like put on an edge. And then there's some genres that they don't get talked about, and you're like, well, where do they fit in this? So like, where does doom metal fit in? Is that middle thing, or because it's not fast like thrash metal
Right.
is, but it does seem kind of extreme. It's definitely not glam stuff. So I don't know that that's a super helpful way of arranging things. And then, we've talked about new wave of British heavy metal. That's not a genre at all. Jeff Barton, who is the guy who coined the term, maybe it's kind of debatable,
Right.
said that it was a catch-all for a melting pot of bands with a lot of different styles. And we can talk about different genres if we're going to differentiate a bit more. So I think that glam is still a useful category.
Yeah.
I know that you don't like the term hair metal, and I agree with you about this because it wound up becoming too inclusive, and the more you're putting into a genre, maybe the less the genre means something, right? So by 87, 88, anything on MTV is hair metal. That doesn't really work, right?
I just, the interesting thing about that is um MTV named it that to make it sound bad and something you shouldn't like because they were bringing in the new brand of a grunge where they all wore flannel and they didn't
Yeah,
shout
yeah,
and then they didn't play fast, they didn't tune their guitars sometimes, they didn't, so it was a reaction to it. So saying hair metal was a put down, you
yeah,
know, because they wanted people to buy into this new Seattle thing.
yeah.
Um, they and I'm kind of surprised the term stuck, and it's like, people even now use the term in a derogatory way. Oh, like that hair metal stuff, like
And I
Smith.
think that when they use the term, they're including not just what we could call glam metal or pop metal, but a lot of stuff that's traditional heavy metal. Like if you can claim that Dio is hair
Oh,
metal doesn't mean anything.
right. Yeah, right. If you're using it to mean a period of time,
Or like Judas Priest. Is Judas Priest hair metal?
no,
No, but
no.
I think they got called that, you know?
Oh yeah, they because they were like a hard rock band or whatever in that
Yeah.
same era. People tend to use it. I mean, you can't call Guns N' Roses hair metal. You can't because
Well,
they were.
you can if hair metal is so wide that it doesn't mean a lot, right?
That's just
Um,
the era. They were the reaction to all the other bands. They were the
yeah,
breath.
yeah.
You know, the first guy to use a Les Paul in like 8 years because everybody's using the hockey stick. You know,
Well, and like turning the sleaze factor up to 11 too.
yes, it's true.
I mean, you
Yeah,
put like Guns N' Roses of 1988, 1989 next to say Poison. Who else would be like a band that's always singing about like love and sex and partying?
it's
Motley Crue.
true.
I think those bands kind of they look kind of pale by comparison to that Guns N' Roses. Now, if you take, you know, Axl Rose today, um, I don't think I don't think he works as an icon like that anymore.
No.
But yeah.
Mhm.
So glam metal, I mean, there is a definite, you know, glam rock in the 60s, 70s. It influences a lot of these bands. It seems to be a largely American driven thing. I won't say exclusively American because you do have Hanoi Rocks and things like that. But you look at where a lot of these bands are coming out of, it's mostly New York and LA. Um, you know, and you could point to like Rat Doc and Quiet Riot. There's like a whole scene. Then there's like we could even call it like softer metal or, you know,
Right.
gateway metal, right?
Gateway
Um,
Fiddle. That's a
yeah,
good
like, you know, like Poison, and I mean Warrant, I would say figures in there.
one. Heavy
Night
guitar.
Ranger, you know. Um, I know that you know, you like Kip Winger, but his band certainly does get parodied. I mean, on Beavis and Butthead, right?
Oh God.
What was the name of the guy had the Winger shirt?
Oh,
Well, Beavis has Metallica. You know?
I how am I forgetting it? Stupid. No. Um, I'll remember. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, ACDC. You know what's weird about that is the idiots were wearing the Metallica and the
yeah,
AC/DC shirt, and you know, but that was the cool thing because they're wearing it, and then you know the normal kids wearing the Winger shirt to show he was a dork.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, yeah, I thought that was in poor taste, but I mean,
The
you
whole
know,
show was in poor taste, though.
oh yeah,
I mean,
I
that was its mo.
yeah, that was his mo. Yeah, I just think taking a jab like that. Well, I guess in pop culture it's fine.
Yeah, I
You
mean, I
know,
think that you can say that there was whatever we want to call it, a genre movement. There was this sense that like you can play music that's hard but not too hard, and I mean we could would you want to include somebody like Triumph in there? I mean their music is very bright, it's very optimistic, it's hard but doesn't go too hard and heavy, you
you know,
know.
that's one that you and I keep trying to think about, but it always made the denim jacket.
Yeah,
Then Rush too. I wouldn't say Rush is metal ever, but Rush made the back. So it's Triumph, Rush, and then you'd have Ozzy, Dio.
yeah,
Um, so that's my test. There is I remember seeing all the jean jackets back in the day where everybody had their favorite bands on it, and
yep,
Triumph is almost a pop rock band. You know, follow your heart. You know, it's like you know
true,
uplifting riff.
yep.
Um, it,
Fight the good fight,
oh yeah,
magic
somebody's
power, you know.
somebody's out there.
Yeah,
Somebody's out there somewhere. See, that's a great pop song. So I would say they're a rock band, but you know, they definitely appealed to a lot of a big audience. I always loved them.
oh
They're
yeah,
a
yeah.
great band.
Well, let's talk about a harder, heavier genre that emerges, and you know, we can talk about power metal, and if we're talking about that from the vantage point of like the 1990s onward, there's a genre. It's very clear that there's a continuity there. I think a lot of people used the term power metal back in the 80s, but they used it in a much looser way. Like when Venom, Kronos is being interviewed from Venom before they have the album Black Metal that comes out that kind of defines what they're doing. He's like, we're doing speed metal, we're doing power metal, we're doing, and he just like rattles off about 8 different things. So I don't think that power metal meant quite the same thing back then, although people were using the term. And if you look at the bands that are influential on later power metal bands, it's it's like Rainbow, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, the Scorpions, and then we see bands like Savatage arise in the 80s, or Riot, the new configuration of it, or Jagdpanzer, and those are clearly power metal. And in the 1980s, there's a German community. Halloween is part of it. Running Wild's early stuff before they get into all the pirate metal, is arguably that.
Yeah.
Blind Guardian, and it's distinctive. It's when we talk about the traits of Triumph, in a way, Triumph is a proto power metal band because power metal tends to be uplifting, bright, the lyrics, they often include a lot of fantasy themes or things like that. It's not a lot of like life is terrible,
Right.
everything sucks, let's
Yeah,
burn it all down, you know.
and that's where lyrics are coming in rather than the sound of the music.
Although I think that for power metal, the sound is really important too. Virtuosic guitar solos.
Well, I'm saying you tied the two together,
Yeah.
and that would be what they had in common, and maybe they're connected in somehow beyond despite that they're sonically different.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you can talk about it as a real genre from, say, the late 80s onward. But before that, there is power metal, sure, but there isn't a power metal genre. Nobody's like, that's the kind of music we do, you know.
That's a good point. And I don't remember, maybe I have. I've heard the word used, but I don't remember ever hearing somebody say, "Oh, they're like a power metal band."
Yeah.
I don't know if prog metal definitely, but power metal, well, this day and age, it's just sounds vague.
Yeah.
You know.
And it tends to be, it seems like geographically, Europe is the center of it.
Yes, that's
Rather,
it's a really good point.
yeah. Prague is another one. I mean, that's a really interesting one because we do have some pretty important prog bands that are influential on heavy metal, and we have some bands that people are like, is it prog or is it metal? Like, think about Uriah Heep, and the answer is depends on the song you pick, man.
Well,
Like
that's true.
Gypsy is heavy metal. Especially when you see him playing it in concert, that's a metal song. But a lot of the other stuff off those first couple albums is straight out, like it's either folk or prog or something like that. King Crimson is pretty influential. You mentioned Rush. Rush will be a more and more proggy band, but they're going to have some influence on quite a few metal bands, including Primus.
Oh, huge. And
whatever the hell Primus is. I mean,
that's
they're hard to classify, right?
That's right. Yeah, that would be a hard one. What's your band like? Well, you're gonna have to come and see.
Yeah. The weirdest show, this is a bit of a side note, I would say the weirdest show that me and Andy ever went to together was, I don't even remember who opened for him, but it was Primus. And holy crap, what a strange crowd. What a bunch of misfits of all different sorts, And we were just like people watching. And of course, they played some of their, classic stuff. And then they played like, I don't remember if they played the entire album, but they played a ton of Farewell to Kings because originally Primus was like doing a lot of Rush tribute stuff,
Oh, I
Les
didn't know
Claypool's super, super into Rush. And he was even on, Geddy Lee does that that show with bassists, right? And he had Les Claypool on it, you know.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah. So, prog now, is there prog metal? And the answer is yeah, there's a distinctive genre, and people talk about like the first really proggy bands being Queensryche and Fate's Warning, so mid 80s, Dream Theater,
Well,
clearly a
Dream
prog
Theater
band.
is now, um, but there's also normal prog. Like I would like Kansas is a prog band,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
Yes is a prog band, but not prog metal.
Yes, exactly.
So,
And you think about like the influence of Yes on heavy metal.
oh
I
my God,
mean, who does Steve Harris say inspired him? Chris Squire,
Chris
you know?
Squire.
So,
Yeah,
that's pretty big. I mean, it's kind of funny because he also says Pete Way, and
Pete
I think
Way.
if you put Pete Way up against Chris Squire, Pete Way doesn't come off that well,
Well,
but
I think he does because UFO, those songs are amazing. And back then, that's
yeah,
when the guitar was just overdriven. Like we keep talking about.
right, right.
And so the bass was much more prominent on those old records, like Lights Out and all that. So I could see people getting into bass back then because the guitars resided in the mids,
Yep,
and
yep.
if you took the bass out, the guitars would sound thin. And
Yeah, and
so,
basses, I mean, in a four-piece band like that, where you only have one guitar and no supporting keyboards, unless somebody wants to like jump onto the piano or something, the the entire riff is being supported by the bass when the guitarist is soloing, so you
right.
better have a good, well-developed riff that a bassist can put forth.
Yeah, and a lot of bassists. What did Tommy Hamilton wrote Kings and Queens, and he has that cool little bass interlude thing in the tune.
Yeah,
Um, something interesting. What's some of these seem to overlap, like prog metal,
yeah.
and then what's math
Well,
metal?
here's one that I'm thinking of. If you wanted to say like what's a early 80s prog metal song, the one that comes to mind for me the most is Phantom of the Opera by Iron Maiden, right?
Yeah,
And that's on the first album, which is supposed to be more punky and stuff like that. It's definitely not a punk song. It's got like the time changes in it. It's 7 minutes long. It's got these like intricate harmonies going on.
yeah,
Um,
that one.
it's got a crazy song about a phantom. It's gonna get you and stuff
I
like
think
that.
I think the punk side of them was the sound and
Running free,
yeah. Oh well, yeah, and we said it before. Um, Paul Di'Anno's a big part of it sounding punk
yeah.
because his singing. I mean, once Bruce Dickinson got in, I didn't think punk at all. I mean, they changed.
Another proggy song off that first album. I don't know. Maybe you think it's not. Remember Tomorrow.
Oh yeah, I love that
You'd
song.
say that is?
Um, that's a tough one because for some reason it works when you would.
Yeah.
Is it a power ballad before power ballads? Well,
Oh,
it's
that's
almost
a
like
good
Children of
call.
the Damned. Children of the Damned, like,
Yeah.
starts off kind of dreamy and quiet, but then has the heavy parts. But Remember Tomorrow is a great song. Yeah, I mean, there's Steve Harris is brilliant at it. It was accessible to people that I wasn't counting the time signatures when I was young.
Yeah.
I just thought it was such a cool song, and so for him to make it musical and not an exercise, like I thought 2112 by Rush, I never liked that album. It sounded like they were experimenting, which is a good thing. But
Yeah.
I don't think Rush made it until Moving Pictures, where they could switch time signatures and stuff, and it doesn't sound like they did. It fit the lyrics.
Yeah. I mean, some of the early stuff is very fun. Think about like Working Man,
Well, that's when they were
um,
like a Zeppelin tribute. Well, they were kind
yeah,
of
it's kind of a straight ahead heavy rock song. It's
yeah,
fun to play. I'll say
yeah.
that. If you're
It's
into like just a straight ahead riff progression.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's yeah. I mean, it's rock and roll. It's the song
Yeah.
that broke them. With
Well,
the
let's talk about another two important genres that are maybe more definitive of the 80s. So there's this term speed metal, and that was big when we were kids, you know.
Yeah,
We were growing up with it, but if you had to ask us, you know, what makes it speed metal? The only thing I think we probably could say is, well, it's fast. You know, it's
right,
faster than like the metal of the 1970s. And it's funny because people read stuff backwards and they're like, well, the first speed metal song was Deep Purple's Speed King, but there wasn't any metal at that time
right.
recognized as metal, let alone genres of it. And okay, it's a fast song, and you know, it does have the thematic of speed. A lot of people would include Motorhead stuff, Judas Priest stuff, some Budgie. The new wave of British heavy metal, you know, is speeding things up as well. You know, you think about not just Iron Maiden, but Tank is a good example. Those
Mhm.
first couple albums, Raven trying to go fast as they can. Um, Venom, early Venom is pretty fast. And then the other band that always gets like labeled as speed metal is Accept. And
Really?
I think once you get into you know, like fast as a shark
Yeah.
territory, it's heavy, it's fast, it's biting.
I always
And
thought
then
back then oh, go ahead.
well, I was
Sorry.
gonna say, but you know, what actually makes something speed metal? You never get a really good definition of it. It's like almost like a transitional phase
I
more than anything else.
Early on, I remember thinking if somebody had a double bass,
Okay.
you know, because they needed to twice as fast. They needed the kick twice as fast. But although that's uh,
It's interesting you bring that up because Speed King is a song that Ian Pace is using a double bass.
see exactly.
And and when I was doing research on this, apparently when they would play it in concert, they would actually bring out a second bass drum
Oh, really?
so he could do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
So by that definition, okay, I guess that could be speed metal. You know?
because yeah, like at the time, you knew the kids around that like they'd get the double bass and the bands that they were into, like Anthrax
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And and you would go over their house and they'd be trying to play to those bands album, but like to have that low end kick drum twice as
Yeah.
fast, you know, um, that to me was like that's what speed metal was when we were first talking about it. When
I
when
mean,
those
there was something we could recognize that it was fast and hard and heavy and aggressive and biting, you know.
yeah,
I never had a good handle on it in the 80s when I was a kid and people were talking about it, like where the boundaries are, you know.
I mean, that's the tough thing. I mean, you said it earlier. I think a lot of times you got to pick a song.
Okay.
Well, I mean, bands like Anthrax, okay, but we've talked about like Blue Oyster Cult. Some of the songs are heavy metal, but some of them just are not.
Yeah, clearly. Yeah.
So it's kind of tough. It would be interesting. It would be interesting for me to now that the semester's starting at Berkeley to start asking a student that's in a math rock band why do you call it math rock, or why do you whatever the genre is, they have the genres. Why is it that genre? Why isn't it just like why is it math rock and not prog?
Yeah. You know, it's funny because you brought up Blue Oyster Cult, and I was thinking about the movie Heavy Metal, you know,
Right.
that we all saw in the 80s on somebody's VCR.
Mhm.
And so Blue Oyster Cult's big song in that was Veterans of the Psychic Wars, I think, right?
Yep.
They also did another song that didn't make it on, apparently. And is Veteran of the Psychic Wars a metal song? I would say no. And I would also even say Sammy Hagar's song, Heavy Metal, that is the first song being played. That is not a metal song, you know?
No, it's Sammy Hagar. It's yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Touching on
But
the Psychic Wars, I you know that's a tricky one because that's a unique tune. It's got the kind of the tribal drums, the big giant tribal drums, and
yeah,
it's about it's about drug addiction,
yeah.
um, and live they certainly the live version of that they extend the middle section and go into double time, and
Okay, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I
I mean,
mean, you
it's
could have
heavy.
you could have songs that are not metal songs in their, um, album format, but when they're played, they start to take on characteristics of that. Like, there's some more poppy bands that we've gone to see play live, and I've been very pleasantly surprised because I only, knew like a few of their songs that had radio airplay, and I'm like, "Oh, I'll go," but it's gonna be, pop rock kind of stuff. I think about, like, for example, the Psychedelic Furs.
Right.
We saw them live here, or Modern English even.
Yep.
They are pretty heavy when they play live, you know? Now, they're not Queensryche heavy, who
No.
we also saw, I mean, when Queensryche is playing live, they are, everything is turned up to 11, but
Yes. Yeah, that's funny because we saw the Psychedelic Furs in Modern English and, um, well, Pet Shop Boys, that was they weren't really heavy. That was more
okay.
synth pop.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, the surprise, I mean, sometimes you go and I'll go to a show and I know a little bit about the band and then I'm like, wow, I had it all wrong about this band, you know.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting, but you wouldn't call them that.
No, you
You
definitely wouldn't call any of them metal bands, but
no,
yeah. Well,
definitely.
let's talk about thrash metal. So the dinosaur in the room, you could say, just 'cause it's so huge. And in the 80s, I mean, I'll speak for myself, and then Scott, you tell me about your experience. So, we had our sort of like traditional heavy metal, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and UFO, from the early period, and then like there were bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, Scorpions, Accept, and Dio, and we're like, oh, this is amazing stuff. And then thrash came out, and you're like, wow, this is kind of different stuff. And I really, you'd respond to it, and you'd be like, I love how heavy this is, and everybody playing it knows what the hell they're doing. They're all great musicians, and it's coming out of speed metal, but it rapidly became its own genre, and you knew what you were getting into. If somebody said this is thrash metal, you
Yes.
knew to look for certain things. And I also think that something that was kind of cool about it, I mentioned tape sharing.
Yes.
So, that was really big in the 80s. Somebody would get an album, and you knew that they had the album, and you'd be like, "Hey man, can you make a copy for me?" Right?
Right.
But with thrash metal, and there were some other bands like that. Raven, I think, had a lot of circulation over tapes. You would have like copies of copies of copies of copies of copies of tapes, and by the time that you got to like the 10th copy, the sound quality was going down, but the
Yeah.
music was good enough where you're like, oh, this is really awesome stuff. And
Right.
we can talk about, like, when we look at the history of thrash, we talk about these two big fours. So the American big four: Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, Anthrax, and then the German big four of Creator, Destruction, Sodom, and Tankard. And I didn't get any of that German stuff because I didn't have the money to buy import stuff at the time. But there was definitely like a scene, and there were other bands too, like Exodus and Overkill. Metal Church was really big when I was in
Yep.
high school, and you'd listen to that. And then there would be local bands, and the local thrash bands, they would be playing covers of this stuff, and then they would have their own thing. And there was an ethos, there was like almost like a uniform, jeans on your legs,
Mhm.
um, either like tennis shoes or boots, band shirts, leather jacket, or jean jacket, and pretty much nothing else. And you would go to these shows and you just headbang all night until your neck almost couldn't support your head because you'd worn it out. And you go home, with your ears ringing from it.
Right.
And you'd have heard some Metallica songs and maybe an Anthrax song, and then whatever this other band who you don't remember, down the line because they never made it,
Right.
whatever else they were coming up with.
Yeah. So I mean, thrash. Well, I mean, I guess when I first heard Master of Puppets,
Okay.
that to me, well, that was kind of new. But it worked because the riffs were cool. I mean, it worked for me.
Yeah, yeah.
It was like kind of screaming for vocals. It was definitely heavy-handed.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And to me, and I really love that album. And to me, I would at the time I would have said that, yeah, this is thrash. This is thrash metal. I mean,
Well,
looking back,
that is how it's defined. I mean, that's like one of the most important albums in that like discography of
yeah,
classic thrash metal. I mean, it's interesting because my introduction to it was through a Metallica album as well, but it was Fade to Black, or not Fade to Black,
oh,
Ride the Lightning.
Ride the
Yeah.
Lightning. I was gonna say no. That fits.
I remember the very first time I heard it. So this is like prototypically 80s metalhead thing. I was hanging out with a buddy and he's like, "Hey, let's go walk over to my other buddy's place. He lives in the basement, man. His parents let him have a room down there." So we go down into his like room in the basement, and like the kid had a guitar and posters everywhere, and he had a stereo, in his room with the equalizers and all
Oh,
that, and big speakers. And he's like, "You got to hear this, man." And I was like, "Okay, let's hear it." And he puts that record on, and I was like, "Oh wow, you got to make me a tape,"
yeah.
And and then I actually had another friend who introduced me to Anthrax. I remember I biked over to his house, and he's somebody actually that we knew from high school. And he had like the big long hair, and he played guitar. And so I'm at his house and he's like, "Listen to this, man." And he puts Anthrax Spreading the Disease on. And I was like, "Oh yeah, this is amazing." He's
Nice.
like, "Take the album," and he didn't let me keep it, of course, but take it home, listen to it, tape it.
Yep.
And actually I remember my first Megadeth. I had that on tape. I was at a record store, and I think I might have read about them in Circus magazine. And I see this tape, and it's "Killing Is My Business," and business is good. It's got the Rattlehead guy, with the
Yeah.
hooks and stuff like that. And so I got it, and I had a Walkman at the time, and I'm walking back to where I'm going to get picked up from school because the record store was like a good mile and a half into town. And I'm listening to it and I'm like, "Oh man, this is amazing." So there was something about, for some of us at least, there was something about the thrash approach that was really compelling.
There were still songs. I remember my introduction to
Yeah, yeah,
my introduction to Anthrax was no, not I'm sorry, Megadeth. Um, in homeroom, you all sat alphabetically, and the
yeah.
kid in front of me was a major metalhead, and he was like the one that fed me what was the new and cool thing,
Okay,
right? And so he invited me over to hear uh Peace Sells, but Who's Buying?
okay.
And he's like, you got to check this band out. And at the time, I didn't know it was Dave Mustaine. I didn't know it had anything to do with Metallica. But yeah, it was one of those. I wanted to go mow some more lawn so I could get my own copy of that. But of course, I taped it so I would have it.
Yeah,
And it's not one of those that my mom would play in the car, right? I got away with the more poppy stuff, but
yeah,
that, but yeah, it just happens to be that in homeroom, the kid in front of me, like he always knew. I don't know how he always knew what the new and like the new metal was. He was just a complete in traditional metalhead, like a loner,
yeah.
and isolated himself with these records. But him and I got along really well. I mean, I think we shared heavy metal as a.
It's funny because another genre that we'll talk about, another extreme genre, is death metal, and
Oh
that
yeah.
gets a takeoff in the 1980s. And I have a homeroom story about that with a guy who I was friends with, and thank God I was friends with him because he was bullied from freshman year onward.
Oh God.
And we had these two gym coaches and teachers, and one of them I was fortunate enough to get Chuck Bova. He was a really good, upstanding guy, scary, tough because he's a gym teacher, but he was very moral and didn't approve of cheating, was stressing need to be respectful towards women and things like that. The
Right.
other guy, who interestingly winds up, down the line getting coach of the year, was just terrible. And he encouraged bullying and very
Oh.
misogynistic and all of that. And unfortunately, this kid was in this other guy's gym class, and he encouraged the jocks to like beat him up, and they would they'd be playing basketball and they'd all be whipping basketballs at the guy and stuff like
Oh
that.
my God.
So this guy's freshman year was terrible, and by I want to say junior year, he had gotten into weightlifting, taking steroids, got really, really tough. And he knew that I was into heavy metal because, I had my hair long and I'd be like
Yeah.
playing stuff on my boombox. And because of the steroids, he kind of had like a locked jaw and he'd talk like this.
Right.
And he's sitting next to me because he's also an S kid, right? But he's further down than Sadler. And I remember one day, so it's a good thing I was friends with him because he started settling scores with all these jocks and just like beating the crap out of them,
This
which
is like
they,
a good movie.
yeah, which they kind of deserved. But I remember like him turning to me one day, and he always looked pretty scary to begin with, and he's like, "I hear that you like metal," and I was like, "Yeah, I like heavy metal," and he's like, "Do you listen to death metal?" And I was like, I'm not even sure what that is, man, but it doesn't sound like something I want to listen to,
Right.
if you're that into it, because you're kind of scary.
Right.
So let's talk about death metal. So death metal is an extreme type of metal that I would say, thrash kind of played itself out by the mid 90s. There's not that big of a scene. It spilled over into all these other things, and the bands that were big thrash bands like Metallica takes a weird turn with the Black Album onward. Even Megadeth starts getting more symphonic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Death metal becomes bigger and bigger and bigger by, I would say, in part always being an international kind of thing. It is coming out of bands in America like Possessed, or the band Death, right? And that's in the mid 80s. And then we get all these other bands like Cannibal Corpse and Obituary.
Obituary. Yes. I forgot
Yeah.
about it.
And if you're into that sort of growling and the kind of thematic that they have, I would say there's some sonic ground with thrash when it comes
Yes,
to
there was.
yeah. And interestingly, here in Wisconsin, it was actually kind of an important location. In
Oh, wow.
1990, one of the first death metal festivals in North America, the Day of Death, was actually held in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is just down the road from here. I didn't know about it because I wasn't into death metal at the time, but
Right.
it must have been something quite big. And death metal's been, so thrash has like flowed into a bunch of different other genres, informing them, I would say. Death metal has spiraled a bunch of subgenres off, So you got all these different niches, let's
Right.
call it, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to be going pretty strong. The fact that there can be rivalries between death and black, I would say, is a sign of the vitality of the genres.
Right.
You don't pick fights with people that you don't think can fight. So
Right. Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that was going on in the hip hop world, so to speak.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Just I mean, they were like the East Coast, West Coast
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
This was more genre specific as far as, but
It is also national, though. I mean, they talk about, like, Norwegian black metal versus Swedish death metal, you know?
right.
So
Well, what was the movie that I always forget the name of, where they Dio's in it a little bit. What's his name's drunk in the pool with his mom,
oh, the decline of Western civilization, right?
and now who did they interview, the guy in the throne with the marshals behind him, and it's like, well, you murdered somebody in another band, you know.
Oh, right, right.
And I forgot what band it was, but the guy spoke like this, and I made a joke. It's like, imagine if they're interviewing him about his gear. I like the Marshall Plexis, like like this guy was talking. He burned churches down.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, and that's an interesting thing too, is there was that whole, also with black metal, that whole ethos of like, you got to, not only are you turning the music up to 11, but you got to turn the antisocial behavior up to 11 in some ways, right?
antisocial. That's a
I
great way.
mean, thrash was like that as well. If you were a thrasher, you're supposed to be kind of a semi-criminal type, and
Yep,
you know,
that's
not
right.
just working a nice warehouse job, coming home to the wife and kids, and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. So the rivalries, I mean, there was rivalries. I mean, I remember I was bullied a lot. Um, and I was always tiny, I was small, couldn't stick up for myself. But, I used to worry about wearing the wrong rock t-shirt to school. Like, I used to think, like, am I going to get away with this one? Or people going
Yeah,
to beat me up or make fun of me even?
yeah, yeah.
I think but I
Who
can
were the
only
right ones and who were the wrong ones at that time?
I'm trying to think. Well, like the Blois to Colt one was cool. Not a lot of people were into them, but it was like, oh, cool, you went to a concert.
Okay,
Because you remember, like, you'd get this T-shirt. I think all of us our age remember, you get the T-shirt at the show, and
right.
you'd wear it the next day
Yeah,
to
yeah.
show off that you went to a concert. Um, I don't. I think Journey was one of the ones I didn't want to wear. Um, who else?
Was that because they were considered too soft, or what
Well,
was the
it was
deal with Journey?
Journey was to most people the band that did Open Arms.
Okay.
Then they didn't realize that they were kicking ass in all kinds of ways.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but there's a lot of deadheads in my school too, which is odd. Well, we
Huh.
didn't have MTV in our town. We didn't have, so I was the only one that knew about Bon Jovi. Now, Bon Jovi would have been a bad shirt to wear to that high school, because
Okay.
they didn't we didn't have MTV. They knew that it was just a bunch of posers is what they thought. But like, it's weird how, but it's more extreme, I think, in what we're talking about here
Oh
with
yeah.
black metal. It's almost like that movie turned me on to the fact that these people are essentially gangs. I think it was Norwegian death metal. I think that's the ones that
Or
we
black
just,
metal.
or
Yeah.
the ones that burn down churches and stuff, like the ones that
Yeah,
actually.
I mean, that's both a death metal, but especially black metal thing.
Yeah, and it's funny because we're calling a genre by the behavior of the band.
Yeah, I mean, the whole heavy metal thing in the 80s certainly got tarred with that,
The
on a bunch
excess.
of different fronts. Think about Geraldo Rivera's Expose. Was that like 86 or
Yes,
87? My
it
mom
was.
actually went and like confiscated my sister's records after watching that for a while, you know.
Yep.
And then there were lawsuits and
Oh
all
God, yeah.
sorts of, yeah, all sorts of other worries about what was gonna happen with that.
The classic
Well,
one being the Aussie one, right? With Suicide
Ozzy
Solution.
and Judas Priest. I mean,
That's right.
with
That's right.
Ozzy, okay, Suicide Solution, it's suicide is in the lyrics and the title, so it kind of makes sense. But those parents who sued over um, it wasn't beyond the realms of death. There was another lawsuit about that, but there was one where uh, the guy shot himself, and they were trying to claim, I think it was a Better Than You, Better Than Me, that there was backward masking saying, do
Right.
it, and you're like, man, this is really stretching it far. I mean, clearly Suicide Solution is an anti-suicide song. It's an
Right.
anti-drinking song,
Right.
but you could at least get the idea that maybe you should kill yourself by listening to it, right?
Maybe they should have
But
read the lyrics.
yeah, but how are the hell are you going to get that out of Better by You, Better Than Me,
Right.
So
And they in both cases, the parents didn't win.
yeah, fortunately, because if they had, I mean, that would have opened the floodgates to all sorts of lawsuits, and maybe it wouldn't have just been metal stuff. It would have been like it's open season on any questionable lyrics.
Well, that's the
So
Tipper Gore thing. That's where that came in. What?
yeah, the what was that list? It was the something 15, like the dirty 15 or the
Yes.
and I think about 10 of them were metal songs on
Right.
there. Um,
John Denver spoke at that. Not that he was being incriminated. They wanted his opinion on all of this. I don't know if you remember seeing John Denver.
no,
Like
what did he say?
he was for all these bands saying what they want to say and songwriting. It's so funny because they're also polite with him and he's very polite with them. And
Yeah.
basically you could look it up, but basically he was saying, he was talking about
Oh,
songwriting.
so here we go. Here's the filthy 15, right? And it's fairly evenly, you could say, divided up into heavy metal, and we'll call it sexy pop, right? So the sexy pop would include Prince, Sheena Easton,
Right.
Vanity, Madonna, um, Cyndi Lauper. Maybe I don't know who the Mary Jane girls are, but they're in my house, made it onto it. And then the metal bands or metal adjacent would be Judas Priest, Motley Crue, AC/DC, Twisted Sister, Wasp, Def Leppard, Merciful Fate, Black Sabbath, and Venom. And okay, some of those you look at them and you're like, okay, Venom's Possessed, Judas Priest, Eat Me Alive, um, Wasp's Animal Fuck Like a Beast. Okay, that makes Merciful Fates Into the Coven. Sure, these are songs that are going to offend people. Some of the other ones, Def Leppard's High and Dry Saturday Night, it's being put on there because it's promoting drug and alcohol use. But so is like every other song on the radio at the time.
Oh my God. Yeah. Of course.
Or
Country songs.
yeah, or let's see, ACD. Well, okay, so ACDC's Let Me Put My Love Into You. Okay,
Yeah.
clearly that's about sex. But Twisted Sisters, we're not going to take it, right? And
Oh,
the reason they gave was violence. Yeah.
it's about the oh my God. Well, that's the chant that scared them. And you have to remember, like I've thought about this. If you put it in perspective, it was about 40 years ago. That was about 40 years ago. So if you
That's right.
think
Yeah.
the people at the times, the adults, they were born in the 40s. So they came up in totally different times, the 50s, and then 60s if they did the hippie thing, but they had a whole different set of morals and a whole different set of it was really that's why every movie and every song was the teens against the parents,
Yeah.
like the Breakfast Club and any of those movies were like, the authorities unreasonable and with Footloose and all those movies where they're going to take dance away from us because it's, and the parents all listen to classical music,
Yeah.
but it's funny because that was running rampant. I mean, you have the example of the Geraldo thing, but there were certain tapes that you wanted to sneak in the house and play when your mom's not around. Like Shout at the Devil was one of them for me. Like, not
Yeah.
not that she'd do anything. I don't know. Maybe maybe she would take it away from me, but like I didn't want to take the risk.
You know, we'll finish up talking about genres in a minute because we're telling so many stories. But I do have a funny story along those lines. So there was a guy, and I carpooled with him because we didn't have like a bus that would go as far out to our neighborhood.
Oh yeah.
And so he was like, it was freshman year in high school, and he was a sophomore, and he could drive. And so he was into like Stevie Nicks and stuff like that, you know. And
Yeah.
he's like, "Hey, before we go home, let's go to the record store." So we
Nice.
we walked to the record store in downtown Waukesha, and he's like, "You know, I've heard some really, really good stuff about this album." And he pulls out Dio's Holy Diver. "You should get this." And I had some money on me, so I was like, is it heavy metal? And he's like, yeah, because he knew I was like into heavy metal. And I was like, okay, I'll get it, you know. So I'm not thinking anything about it, right? I'm just thinking this is like good, you know, metal music. And I'm not thinking about the fact that it's got a, you know, essentially a devil on the
Right.
front of it. And the holy diver is a priest who's chained up being thrown into a lake by the devil. So
Yeah, yeah.
I
But
get home, and my mom's like, "How was your day at school?" And I was like, "Pretty good. I got an album." She's like, "Oh, cool. Why don't you show it to me?" So I get it out, and she's like, "Gee, that's terrible. You can't listen to that sort of stuff. That's devil worship." And I, you know, I was like, "Well, I don't know that it is, you know.
right.
I want to actually like hear it and see what the songs are." And you know, it was a pretty awesome album.
Yeah.
And she was so mad. She's like, "You have to take that back to the store and get your money back," you know?
Oh
So,
my God. That's classic.
yeah. But well, let's talk briefly about black metal. So,
Yeah.
another genre that does take off in the 80s, right? Which is quite important. And now it's weird, right? Because when you listen to Venom's album Black Metal, would you actually call that black metal in the sense that the genre turned to? You know, it's low production quality, which their first two albums definitely were, which gives it a kind of raw sound, very earthy. There was a lot of stuff with people saying, "Oh, these guys can't actually play their instruments." That's bullshit. They were
Oh,
actually
yeah.
quite good, especially Kronos on the bass, you know.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, it's all this crazy, let's do drugs, let's have sex, let's worship the devil kind of stuff, you know, metal, you know, it's very self-consciously heavy metal, and it
Of course.
spawns
Yeah.
like a whole kind of movement, you know. And you get other bands, you know, a lot of them are European, right? Bathory in Sweden, Merciful Fate in Denmark, Hellhammer, and then later Celtic Frost in Switzerland. We do get some American genre stuff, but it spawns this entire interesting movement. And then, like death metal, it goes off in a whole bunch of different niche directions. And I think, you know, it's still going strong enough as opposed to, like, say, I mean, there are thrash bands out there and they are doing interesting things, but I'd say that thrash, if we are going to use that classification of the three steps, it's in the decay phase.
Mhm.
Whereas I don't think that death or black metal are. I think they're still going pretty strong. And then the last genre that we were going to talk about, that no, it gets, you know, people talk about it as a genre, I would say from like the 90s onward, but there's a lot of bands that fit the mold for it. Would be doom, one of my favorite genres of heavy metal, because, you know, it starts with Black Sabbath,
Yeah.
but there's other bands around the time that are also doing what we can recognize as doom metal, like Sir Lord Baltimore, who only put out, you know, a few albums, but they're viewed as kind of like the American Black Sabbath. Um, you know, there's a couple other bands that never really made it that I would say were doing that. Lucifer's Friend, um, Pentagram, who never recorded anything. That was actually like a record until the 80s, but we're playing in the 70s. We have a lot of bands that are kind of doomy, like Witchfinder General in the 80s in the new wave of British heavy metal. Over in California, you got Sirith Ungol, and then I would say it like takes off as a self-conscious genre from the 90s onward. And I'll be very honest, I don't listen to a lot of contemporary stuff with newer bands, but that is one genre where I do have like favorites that are newer, including one who I'm hoping someday get back together, called Orchid,
Oh
who, yeah, I mean, one of the best lines I've ever seen is Orchid plays the songs that Black Sabbath never recorded. And it's
oh,
not like the singer sounds like Ozzy or the guitarist sounds like Tony Iommi, but they sound like Sabbath,
that's
you know,
cool.
but they have their own distinctive thing too.
Sure.
And so I think that's a really viable genre. And can we say that it developed in the 80s? Yeah, I mean, but it didn't develop as a self-conscious thing like death metal or thrash metal did in the
Right.
80s, right?
Well, I agree. Black Sabbath is anybody influenced or inspired by Black Sabbath has the potential to be a doom metal band. You know,
I think there's certain traits you have to have. You have to have like the plotting instead of like, so think about it by contrast to thrash. Thrash speeds things up.
right?
A lot of what do you call that? Where you're hitting with the pick and it's that choppy sound,
Yeah,
uh, palm muting
yeah,
sort of thing.
exactly.
So with doom metal, you're more letting things ring out and going through it. There is dissonance in it. Um,
It's just gloomy. I mean, I always
that's a
pictured
good that's a good term. Gloomy. Yeah, I like that.
it's every time I listen to Sabbath, like it was like a cold, kind of rainy, foggy day or night or something. It was never you never pictured a nice sunset when you listened to Sabbath. I didn't, you know. So it brought to mind like things that were gloomy in a good way. I mean, it really and they're I would say, yeah, they're obviously the godfathers of it. They were unique in that way, I guess. Come to think of it, now that we're talking about it, like back in
Yeah.
that time, like their contemporaries didn't do anything like that, did they? No.
Um, I think there's a few bands that are doing similar stuff, but not as consistently, you know,
Oh, I
and they're
see.
not making the impact that Black Sabbath is.
Right.
So, I mean, imagine if Pentagram and Saint Vitus would be another good example from the 1980s. If Pentagram actually like had their stuff together, they're in Virginia, they're playing around. They don't actually make any album. I want to say until like the mid 80s. If they'd actually started, and there are recordings of what they were doing in the 70s, if that stuff had gotten out, maybe they would have had a lot of traction.
Yeah, probably if they got their act together. Yeah,
But
right.
they weren't in a good place. I mean, they were in like Virginia, I think.
And maybe
Um,
they didn't have the funds to fund their own record. That's possible.
yeah, so Alexandria, Virginia, um, active in the underground scene, produced demos and rehearsal tapes. And first album, let's see when they actually put it out, is 1985. So
Oh,
by
wow.
then it's kind of too late.
Wow, that's quite a wait.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were this is a bit of a subtopic, but I think there were quite a few bands that missed their opportunities because they didn't get an album out when it really would have benefited them to do so.
Right.
Great example of that in the new wave of British heavy metal is Chrome Molly. Great band. They get included on a few compilations, but I think their first album comes out in like 84 or 85. And by
Hmm.
that time, the new wave of British heavy metal is over, and they're
Right.
not just going to get they're just not going to get the play that they should have.
Yep. Yeah, that's another thing that's interesting. The timing of when they're presented. I mean, there's so many bands that like would have done great had they put albums out in 86 or 87, but they put them
Yeah,
out in 91 when that style of music was not cool anymore. It wasn't in vogue. So
yeah,
it's so you needed to be from Seattle and play grunge, as they call it.
yeah. Actually, let's close with kicking that idea around a little bit. So I've seen some people propose that grunge should properly be considered, at least some of it, a subgenre of heavy metal. And there's some parts of it that do make sense. Okay, so the ethos is different, right? But you got heavy guitars, bass that's often following the guitars. Um, you do have different lyrics, but metal was starting to, by that time, have lyrics about anything under the sun as well. Um, there are still good people will say there's no guitar solos in grunge. That's complete bullshit, you know.
Well,
Um,
Pearl Jam, there was solos
yeah,
in Pearl.
and Nirvana has, think about
Yep,
in Smells Like Teen Spirit, right? There's
right.
da, 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 and now it's a the guitar solos
There's the
don't
melody.
tend to be like shredding. They tend to be more following along the vocal line, right? But
That or
Tony
blues,
Iommi did that, you know?
right? That or bluesy stuff, like,
Yeah, yeah,
but it wasn't acceptable to do what happened in the 80s.
yeah,
So, but I mean, you wouldn't say that about Nirvana. I wouldn't say Pearl Jam, but I mean, Soundgarden, they were
yeah.
happy.
And now one of the bands that's really interesting in that respect, Alice in Chains.
Yeah, another
I
one.
mean, they're considered grunge, but I want to say they're not. They're actually a 1990s heavy metal band, and
No,
actually
I
one of
agree.
the
And
better new bands emerging in the 1990s.
those were two of my favorite ones, Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. I thought
Yeah,
th- I people get lazy and they call it grunge because it happened in the 90s.
right. Yeah,
But Soundgarden wasn't a grunge band. Were they from Seattle? I don't remember, but
I think so. Yeah,
well, so was Queensryche.
true. Yeah, yeah. There you go.
So yeah, it's funny because a lot was happening then. Like even the singer songwriter world, when Lilith Fair and all that, where it was like all the singer songwriters that came out in the 90s that got pretty big. But for rock, I mean, like Nirvana, no, Pearl Jam, no. Um, who's the band that did Plush?
Oh,
Um,
Stone Temple Pilots.
oh, but they became heavy.
Well, yeah, with that one album, I would say, because I really liked that. And then
Yeah.
everything after that, I was like, what the hell are they doing?
Oh, so you're right. It was the other way. It must have been the other way around.
Yeah, yeah,
I heard a heavy album from them before,
yeah.
and I said, "This is not Stone Temple Pilots." And then I ended up doing a bar gig in my 20s where that was in the set. Well, what was the song? It was a heavy song. I don't remember. But it was definitely from that heavier album, and
Yeah, yeah.
I liked playing it because it was cool. It was cool. It had like the palm muting of the
You know, that's an interesting thing. So I was playing, and I never got very good, but I was playing a lot of bass in the from about 90 to 94,
yeah,
when I was in college. And my repertoire included like a lot of Metallica, a lot of Iron Maiden, a lot of Black Sabbath, so classic metal stuff, some Judas Priest stuff. But I was also playing, Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Stone Temple Pilots and stuff like that. And it's interesting because I would actually, so I was doing the sort of thing like Lemmy would do, where I would either overdrive or distort my sound, and I would be usually playing with pretty small bands where the guitarist wasn't particularly good, and so I was filling in a lot of the guitar part,
That's cool.
and I didn't see a ton of like distance between the stuff that I was playing with classic metal stuff and the stuff I was playing with grunge stuff. You know,
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, there are certain bands for sure, but there were certain rock bands that were just rock bands like anything else, I guess.
yeah, yeah. Like a big one at that time was Big Head Todd and the Monsters.
I remember, yeah.
I like playing their stuff, but they were not metal by any
No,
means.
no, definitely not.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a
I
good one.
still cover on the banjo one of their songs, "Circle," and that's a heavy song, but it's not a metal song.
I don't know if I'll have to check that one out.
It's fun, it's got a
Yeah,
riff to it, so, and of course, it's got these kind of, could mean anything whatsoever kind of lyrics, so
right.
very 90s kind of
Very
stuff.
90s, yep. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you wanna say about genres? We've covered quite a few. We talked about where they came from, um,
I I
or
I guess I would wrap up by saying it's difficult, especially today. If you go back to the 60s, it was really easy compared to now. You had the blues, you had rock and roll, you had pop, but now it's just because with each generation they're influenced by more different kinds of music, and then they make a new kind of music, and then the next generation takes all this new music, and it just keeps kind of flowing out, where I think
yeah.
we've lost. I don't know if genres. I, I don't know how important genre is, because now it's coming to many sentences of describing what the music is like. Where it comes down to, essentially, you have to hear it. You could say it's heavy,
Yeah.
or you could say it's kind of like psychedelic. You know,
Here's something. So pure conjecture here. But you get to work with a lot of younger people. Do you think that having all these different genres is something useful for them for figuring out like where do they want to go, or do you think it's more because like each genre has like its own criteria list that it's more restrictive? Like you belong to this community, so you can't go over there because you're doing this kind of metal, not this kind of metal. You know,
well, that's what's. I think it's. I don't think it's good to have, and I don't think a lot of them have a genre in mind. I mean, they may copy a new kind of artist in a way, but um, I don't. It's to the point where they don't know how to describe it, and I always say, why do you want to call it something?
okay,
Because it's that complicated. It's like, why do you want
yeah,
to call
yeah.
it? It's not like you have to figure out whether your record goes in the record store. Um, and if it did, it would probably just go under rock. Like
You
you
do have to be able to provide metadata though for like streaming services and stuff. You know,
yeah, I'd be curious to see
and
like
those are a mess.
all
Like
those.
you know, I've seen like in Apple Music. So I don't use Spotify, but Apple Music has classifications of what things are. And there's a lot where they actually do get it right as far as like this is actually metal, but
Right,
there's a lot of things where you're like, this is so like I've seen Def Leppard, um, their early albums, one's considered metal, one's just considered hard rock, you
right,
know? And you're like, they're part of the new wave of British heavy metal at that point. So what are you doing there?
right.
Or here's actually I did tabulate this. So in Apple Music, except Armored Saint, Deep Purple, Dokken, and Fastway are all classed as rock and not metal.
Oh my
Um,
gosh,
one Armored Saint album is classed as pop. Now,
it's a mess.
Yeah, I mean, Armored Saints, they're all metal. You know, they didn't do any just plain old rock stuff. And Judas Priest is you know, they're clearly a metal band. Um, some of their albums are considered just rock.
Yeah, they don't know what they're doing, or they just throw something on there. But
Yeah.
I like with all these bands that are, I should look up bands like Covet because students call them math rock,
Okay.
and I wonder what they would be on. Do you have Apple Music there?
I do. Yeah. So you want me to open it up and check it out?
Yeah, so Covet, Covet. I wonder what they
Oh,
would classify them as.
all right. Let's see. So I'm not seeing them come up as an artist.
Really?
Is it just Covet?
Covet. Yeah, I think or try Yvette Young is the guitarist, and she has her own albums out. Young, Yvette Young, overview songs,
She comes up as an artist.
alternative indie dance electronic. I would say none of those would describe what she does.
Yeah.
Is that what they say on your end?
Um, let's see. Oh, wait, there is actually Covet came up.
Okay.
Now. It's a 3-person band. Does
Yep.
that sound right?
That's right.
Let's see. So alternative.
It's not.
I mean, an alternative is such. So one is alternative, one is rock, and then the other album is alternative again. But I mean, alternative is one of those terms that, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything. It was coined in the 80s and it covered
Right.
this huge spectrum. There is alternative metal, but when I was like looking into that, I was like, unless you like go deeper into it and you're talking about like say new metal or
Right.
this thing, it doesn't really it doesn't mean much.
Well, a lot of students um, call them math rock. I mean, if you ask
Okay.
anybody who would cover it, is their math rock,
I don't
and
think that Apple has a classification.
well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, they only have the up to 1990 um, labels.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been a far-ranging conversation. Should we just draw it to a close now, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So glad you could join us, and you want to have the last word, Scott?
No, I just think it is a very interesting topic, and it's a good one to go through because it's one I always struggle with. And in the end, I think um, genre, yeah, like why do you want to call it something? It's best listened to it. But the explanation these days could be multiple sentences, like I said, rather than just rock.
Yeah.
So, and giving people like a wrong idea, like that's saying alternative. Well, you might not listen to it because you might hate grunge, right? That was alternative, but it's not grunge at all. So that's where it can hurt people. Like, oh, I don't want to listen to an alternative band. But that's all I have to really say about it. It was a great topic.
Yeah. Glad we finally got to it.
Me too.